Welcome, listeners. You are about to immerse yourself in a thrilling mystery, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of intrigue and suspense. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Case of the Midnight Masquerade. The ballroom, resplendent with crystal chandeliers and gilded accents, was alive with the soft murmur of conversation, the rustle of silk gowns, and the tinkling of glasses filled with champagne. The music, a delicate waltz played by an orchestra in the corner, seemed to float through the air like a forgotten dream. It was a world of beauty, of elegance, of joy, until it was shattered. Sherlock Holmes stood at the edge of the crowd, a quiet observer among the revellers, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, every subtle shift in movement. Beside him, Dr. John Watson adjusted his waistcoat and looked out at the sea of masked faces. The masquerade ball was in full swing, and yet Holmes's attention never wavered from the shadows of the room. He was not drawn to the masks, nor to the sparkling jewels, nor the delicate perfume that drifted past him. His mind was always calculating, always looking for the anomalies, the small inconsistencies that others missed. And yet tonight, despite the grandeur around him, there was something almost unsettling in the air. "The night seems to have taken a peculiar turn," Watson remarked with a wry smile, sipping from his glass. "Not your usual haunt, Holmes." Holmes did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on a group of guests standing near the far end of the ballroom. He had noted their mannerisms, the way they glanced over their shoulders, the subtle shift in their posture, as though they were aware of something more than mere revelry. But it was not until the scream that split the night that Holmes's suspicions were truly realized. It was a single sharp cry, so sudden and so out of place that for a moment the entire room fell into a stunned silence. Conversation ceased, laughter faltered, and every eye turned toward the grand staircase where Lady Eleanor, the hostess's assistant, was now standing, her face pale, her hands trembling as she pointed to the closed door of the study. There's something wrong," she gasped. "Lord Blackwood, he's been murdered." The words seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat, the shock too great to process. The room erupted into chaos. Footsteps pounded the marble floor as people hurried to the study, whispering frantic speculations. But Holmes did not move at once. He stood there, his eyes narrowing, his fingers steepling thoughtfully before his face. A murder? At a masquerade ball? The sheer audacity of it sent a ripple of unease through him, but his mind, ever methodical, was already beginning to piece together the fragments of a mystery, yet unsolved. "Holmes," Watson urged, his voice cutting through the noise. "Shall we investigate?" Holmes nodded, his gaze already fixed on the study door. "There is no need to rush. We must approach this with the requisite caution." They made their way through the bustling crowd, past hushed conversations and fearful glances, until they reached the door of the study. Lady Eleanor was still standing in the hallway, her hands clutched tightly in front of her, her eyes wide with terror. I found him like this," she stammered. "The door was locked from the inside and... oh God, his body..." She could not finish, her voice faltering as she motioned to the door. Holmes did not waste time with pleasantries. With a quiet nod, he pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the fireplace, casting long shadows across the dark wood panelling. At the centre of the room, Lord Blackwood lay sprawled over a large antique desk, his body grotesquely twisted as though his final moments had been full of pain. A deep gash marred his back, and the ceremonial dagger, a piece that had been displayed prominently among the evening's decorations, was embedded in his flesh. The room was eerily still, save for the faint crackling of the fire. Holmes stepped into the room, his eyes flicking from the body to the surroundings with a calculated intensity. He bent over the desk, examining the position of the body, noting the angle at which the knife had entered. The mark on the back of Lord Blackwood's neck suggested the attack had come swiftly, yet the lack of a struggle indicated that the victim had not anticipated the violence. His gaze shifted to the small collection of papers on the desk. Among them, a letter had been hastily discarded, half written, half burned in the hearth. Holmes studied it for a moment, his brow furrowing as he noted the unmistakable family crest on the seal, now partially scorched. Without touching the letter, he turned to Watson. "Examine the room carefully. Look for anything unusual," Holmes instructed, his voice low but firm. "Every detail here must be accounted for." As Watson moved to inspect the corners of the room, Holmes turned back to the body, his eyes narrowing. Lord Blackwood had been well liked, respected by many in society, yet someone had seen fit to end his life in this most public of settings. But who, and why? It seemed unlikely that the murderer would have been a stranger to the host, particularly in such a secluded room. Holmes's thoughts were interrupted as Watson's voice broke through the tension. "Holmes, you'll want to see this." Watson had knelt beside a small table in the corner of the room where a silver goblet had been overturned. Beside it, a small pool of red liquid glistened against the dark wood, a stain that could easily be mistaken for wine. Yet upon closer inspection, it was clear that the substance was blood. Fresh blood. Holmes stepped forward, his mind already racing. This was no mere accident. Lord Blackwood had known his killer, and that killer, Holmes was certain, was still among them. Holmes stood motionless by the desk, his eyes scanning the room once more. The bloodstain near the overturned goblet had caught his attention, but he did not yet draw conclusions. There were too many variables. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the desk as he stepped away from the body. He turned slowly, taking in every detail, absorbing the atmosphere of the room, the faint hum of muffled voices from outside the door. "I trust you've noticed the bloodstain, Watson?" Holmes remarked, his voice low but certain. Watson, who had been inspecting the goblet and the surrounding area, nodded. "It's fresh, no doubt about it. But it doesn't seem to match the wound, does it?" "No, it doesn't." Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the small stain, as though it held some deeper meaning. Lord Blackwood's blood is dark, likely pooling beneath him from the wound in his back. This stain is lighter, fresher. This was spilled recently, perhaps while the body was still warm. Watson knelt beside the goblet, examining the liquid closely. The faint shimmer of firelight glinted off the surface, but there was something off about it, a discordant note in the room's otherwise still ambience. He looked back at Holmes. "So someone else was here after the murder? Someone who might have had direct contact with the victim?" Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he moved towards the edge of the room, his gaze falling on the half-open window. The night outside was quiet, nothing more than the faint rustle of leaves carried by the breeze. He crossed the room in 2 swift steps, inspecting the window frame with practiced precision. There was no sign of a break-in, but the latch had been tampered with. A small indentation on the wood suggested the window had been opened recently, though there was no sign of force. "Nothing to suggest entry through here," Holmes murmured. "But the room was locked. The key..." He turned back towards Watson, his sharp eyes now calculating. "We must take the guest list into account, and the people most likely to be near the victim." Watson, still kneeling, took a moment before speaking. "What of the dagger? Why use something so ostentatious?" Holmes paused, considering this. He stood at the window for a moment longer, letting the silence fill the room before responding. "A weapon chosen for its symbolic significance, not its practicality," Holmes said quietly, turning back toward the body. "That dagger, one of Lord Blackwood's prized artifacts, was on display tonight as part of the evening's entertainment. It was not a weapon of opportunity. The murderer was aware of its presence, likely familiar with Blackwood's collection. It speaks to a certain intimacy between the two. The killer knew Lord Blackwood well." Watson stood, his brow furrowed in thought. "That's troubling. So we're looking for someone within the circle of acquaintances. But..." "There are always complications," Holmes interjected. He glanced toward the door, where a thin line of light crept beneath, the muffled sound of voices rising in the hallway. "And we must be cautious in how we proceed. I believe we may have several suspects among the guests here tonight. Holmes's mind moved swiftly, pulling together the loose threads of the case. The masquerade ball had brought together a variety of individuals, each with their own motives, their own lives and secrets. It was a carefully curated group, but that very intimacy created a fertile ground for betrayal. And someone in this room had decided to strike. Watson stepped away from the desk, his eyes now scanning the faces of the few remaining guests who had yet to be escorted from the room. The look on their faces was a mix of confusion and dread, their masks now no more than a barrier between them and the truth. "Shall we start with Lady Margaret?" Watson asked, his voice breaking through Holmes's focused silence. Holmes glanced over at her, standing quietly at the edge of the group, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was no evidence to suggest she was guilty, but her presence had not gone unnoticed. The widow of Blackwood's late brother, Lady Margaret, had always been a subject of quiet speculation. The inheritance, the family disputes, it made her a potential suspect in the most primal sense. But Holmes was not a man to jump to conclusions. His mind, razor-sharp and calculating, preferred to gather all the facts before drawing his conclusions. "Lady Margaret is a possible suspect," Holmes mused aloud, "but she may be a distraction. We will see what she has to say, though I doubt she will reveal anything of substance just yet. Her motives, though, are practical." Watson met his gaze. "You think she stands to gain something from Blackwood's death?" "There are always finances to consider." Holmes's expression softened with a touch of cynicism. "The question is whether she would go so far as to murder her own brother-in-law for it." Watson's gaze lingered on Lady Margaret, who now looked over at them, her expression tense, her eyes flickering with a hidden uncertainty. There was something else there, a fragility, perhaps, or something deeper beneath the surface. But before Watson could voice his thoughts, a soft voice interrupted them. "Gentlemen?" Holmes turned, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Charles Devereux approaching them. The tall, lanky figure had been lingering in the background, but now he stepped forward, his face pale, his jaw tight with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I must speak with you," Devereux continued, his voice trembling. This cannot be. Lord Blackwood, he was my cousin. He stopped, his voice faltering for a moment. "I don't understand. Who would do such a thing?" Holmes studied him with quiet intensity, noting the tremor in Devereux's voice and the sweat on his brow. It could have been the shock of the moment, but there was something about the way the man held himself, something that set Holmes on edge. "You knew Lord Blackwood well, Mr. Devereux?" Holmes asked calmly, his voice measured. Devereux nodded, his eyes shifting briefly toward the door before returning to Holmes. "Of course. We shared many discussions. He was a good man, but with his own faults. There were things that should never have come to light." Holmes's brow furrowed, his instincts sharpening. "Such as?" Devereux hesitated, then looked away. "I don't know what happened in that room, but if I can help in any way, I will. I owe it to him." Holmes was silent for a long moment. He said nothing about the obvious discomfort in Devereux's words, the subtle unease that seemed to linger in his every motion. Instead, Holmes allowed the silence to stretch out, letting the pressure mount. "We shall see, Mr. Devereux," Holmes said quietly. "We shall see." The following hours bled into each other, a hazy blur of unanswered questions and mounting uncertainty. The house, once a beacon of grandeur, now felt like a tomb. The guests had been dismissed to their rooms, the air thick with whispered rumours and the oppressive weight of the murder that had shaken them all. But Holmes was undeterred, his mind spinning relentlessly as he processed the fragments of information that had begun to accumulate. He stood by the large window overlooking the sprawling grounds, his gaze lost in the darkening sky. The mansion was set against a backdrop of lush gardens, their tranquil beauty now rendered grotesque by the shadows of death. His thoughts were far from the scenic view, though. They circled back to Lord Blackwood's death. the strange circumstances surrounding it, and the subtle web of lies and deceit that seemed to be growing tighter with each passing moment. Behind him, Watson sat in a plush armchair, flipping through the guest list once again. His brow furrowed with frustration, and Holmes could almost hear the silent questions forming in his mind. Yet, despite the deepening confusion, Watson remained silent, knowing that Holmes's methods would reveal the answers in due time. It was the waiting that was the hardest. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes locking onto Watson's. "There's something we're missing," he said, his voice calm but firm, as though he was speaking to himself more than to Watson. Watson looked up from the list, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Something beyond the obvious, you mean?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "I'm beginning to suspect that the murder is not simply a matter of inheritance or family rivalry. It's more personal than that." "You believe the motive is deeper?" Watson's voice carried the weight of curiosity, but also something else, a note of concern. Holmes's lips curled into a faint, contemplative smile. "I do. But as with all mysteries, the devil is in the details. We must look beyond the obvious suspects, Lady Margaret Devereux, and examine the guests who were not so close to Lord Blackwood. There may be a shadow lurking among those who appear to be innocent." The two men were interrupted by the soft knock of the door, and a servant entered, bowing respectfully. "Sir, Lady Margaret requests your presence," the servant announced, her tone tight, as though she too could sense the heavy atmosphere hanging over the mansion. "She says it is urgent." Holmes glanced at Watson, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said, already moving towards the door. "It seems we are to make a start on unraveling this." As they entered the grand hallway, the distant sound of whispers grew louder, muffled voices that seemed to swirl around them like smoke. Holmes could feel the tension in the air, an invisible weight pressing down upon them as they made their way toward the drawing room where Lady Margaret awaited. When they entered, Lady Margaret stood by the fire, her posture stiff, her hands tightly clasped in front of her. Her once composed demeanour seemed shaken now, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as they entered, her eyes flickering with something akin to desperation. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice tight, "I need your help. There is something I must confess, something that I've kept hidden for too long." Holmes did not move, his face as impassive as ever. "Confession?" he repeated, his voice calm but carrying a note of curiosity. "You've already told me much of what I need to know, Lady Margaret. What more is there to reveal?" Lady Margaret's eyes darted around the room nervously, as though searching for an escape. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's about the dagger. The one that killed my brother-in-law. She hesitated, and Holmes caught the faintest flicker of fear in her gaze. "I know where it came from, and I know who else might be involved in this." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes narrowing with intensity. "You know who the murderer is?" She shook her head, a faint sob escaping her lips. "No, I don't know that. But I know someone who has the motive, someone who has been hiding in plain sight." Her voice trembled as she continued. "It's Charles Devereux. He's been threatening Lord Blackwood for weeks, ever since the engagement." "Engagement?" Watson interjected, raising an eyebrow in confusion. "To whom?" Lady Margaret's eyes flickered toward Watson, her expression now taut with strain. "To me," she whispered. "Lord Blackwood had arranged for me to marry Devereux's son. A marriage of convenience. But Devereux was furious. His pride had been wounded. He wanted my fortune, and he had been pressuring me to convince Blackwood to allow the union. But Blackwood refused." Holmes remained silent, taking in every word, every gesture. It was clear that Lady Margaret was not lying about the nature of the pressure she had been under. But the question remained. Did she know enough to point the finger at Devereux with certainty? Or was this simply another in a series of red herrings? "And Devereux, you say, has been threatening Blackwood?" Holmes's voice remained steady, but there was a sharp edge to it now. "And yet, here you are, telling me all this, after your brother-in-law's death. How can I be certain of the veracity of your claims?" Lady Margaret's face crumpled under the weight of Holmes's scrutiny, and for a moment she looked as though she might collapse. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want any of this. But it's true. Devereux would have killed him to get what he wanted. The dagger. It's his. I'm certain of it." Holmes studied her for a long moment, his mind working furiously to sort through the details. Devereux had the motive, yes, but was he capable of murder? And what of Lady Margaret's own role in this? Had she too been playing a dangerous game of manipulation, hiding her true feelings behind a mask of decorum? "I see," Holmes said finally, his voice cool. "We will investigate Devereux further. But remember, Lady Margaret, the truth will always find its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried." She nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I had to tell someone." As Holmes and Watson turned to leave, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Holmes's mind churned with questions, but one thing was becoming clearer by the minute. The case was more complex than he had first imagined, and the true killer was still hidden among them. The house felt colder now, not in temperature, but in the sense of something having shifted beneath its gilded surface. The murder of Lord Blackwood had unsettled the carefully curated lives of those within these walls, but as Holmes and Watson made their way toward the study to continue their investigation, there was an undeniable tension that hung in the air. The mystery was deepening, and every moment spent inside this house felt like a piece of a much larger puzzle that refused to come into focus. Holmes had listened to Lady Margaret's confession with calculated patience, but as he examined her story, he found too many inconsistencies. She had spoken with genuine emotion, but Holmes was not one to be swayed by the visible signs of distress alone. No, there was something in her words that did not sit right with him. The truth, he knew, would reveal itself in the details. As they re-entered the study, Holmes's mind raced. He had asked Watson to search the room earlier, and while his companion had focused on the bloodstains and the positioning of the body, Holmes had been drawn back to the desk itself. The papers scattered across the surface had held little meaning at first glance, but as Holmes moved toward the desk again, his fingers brushed against something that had been partially hidden underneath a thick layer of paperwork. It was a letter. Holmes paused, his hand hovering over the edge of the document. There was no immediate urgency, but something in the way it had been carelessly discarded caught his attention. He carefully extracted the letter, taking care not to disturb its fragile condition. It was a personal note, rushed and incomplete, as if written in a moment of agitation. But it wasn't the content of the letter that grabbed Holmes's attention. It was the family seal. He turned the letter over slowly, revealing the embossed crest. It was unmistakable, the crest of the Devereux family. Watson, who had been standing nearby, took a step forward. "Holmes, what is it?" Holmes's gaze flickered toward his companion, his face impassive. "This is key," he murmured. "Devereux. This letter was written by Lord Blackwood, and it is addressed to Charles Devereux. We must read it carefully." Holmes unfolded the letter with deliberate precision, his eyes scanning the hurriedly scribbled lines. The writing was uneven, as though Blackwood had been trying to quickly compose a message in the midst of a confrontation. The words, though not fully legible, spoke volumes. "I must speak with you tomorrow, Charles. There are matters of the utmost importance that cannot wait. The decision I am about to make will change everything. Holmes stopped, the realization dawning on him as he examined the partially burned edges of the paper. The letter had been torn. The end of the message was lost to the flames of the hearth. "A decision that would change everything," Watson echoed. "Holmes, what does this mean?" Holmes turned the letter over again, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. "It means Blackwood had been considering something something that Devereux would not have taken kindly to. This letter was likely the reason for the conflict between them. But what decision could Blackwood have made that would lead to his death? Could it be the engagement? Watson ventured. Perhaps Blackwood was changing his mind about Lady Margaret's marriage to Devereux's son. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. This was something else. This was a decision of far greater consequence, one that would have threatened everything Devereux had worked for. Watson stepped back, crossing his arms in thought. So, the motive becomes clearer. But if Devereux was behind it, why leave such a letter? Why not just destroy it? Holmes paused, his eyes flickering to the fireplace. That, Watson, is the question. If Devereux were involved, why would Blackwood have kept such a letter that, once read, would point directly to him? The implications were undeniable. The letter was a critical clue. It revealed that Blackwood had been planning something that Devereux had not approved of, something that would have deeply affected his future. But there was more. The letter had been destroyed in part, yet it was still present in the study. Whoever had been in the room, whether by accident or design, had left behind this piece of evidence that was now undeniably linked to Charles Devereux. Holmes stood for a long moment, silent, as though absorbing the weight of what he had uncovered. He placed the letter back on the desk, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. There was something nagging at him, a piece of the puzzle that refused to fit. "We must see Devereux again," Holmes said finally, his voice steady. "We have a great deal more to discuss." The two men moved swiftly through the house, heading toward Devereux's chambers. Holmes's mind was working in overdrive. Devereux's involvement was no longer a mere suspicion. The letter had confirmed his connection to the victim, but Holmes's instincts told him there was something else, something more devious hiding beneath the surface. Devereux was a man who had shown his hand, yes, but had he played all his cards? Holmes's gut told him no. When they arrived at Devereux's door, Holmes did not hesitate. He knocked sharply, his voice cold and commanding when it was answered. "Mr. Devereux, we must speak." Devereux appeared at the door moments later, his face pale, his movements stiff. He seemed surprised, but made no attempt to deny Holmes' entry. "Of course," he said, his voice tense. "What is it that you need?" Holmes stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the room. There was a certain coldness to it, the decor sparse, yet meticulously arranged. But it was Devereux himself who captured Holmes's attention, his eyes betraying a flicker of something that Holmes could not ignore. Fear, perhaps? Or guilt? It was hard to say, but something was amiss. "We've found something," Holmes said bluntly, holding up the letter. "A letter addressed to you, written by Lord Blackwood. It seems you had more than a passing interest in his affairs." Devereux's expression remained neutral, but Holmes noted the slight twitch in his jaw. "I don't know what you're implying," Devereux replied, his voice tight. I had no idea what Blackwood was planning." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then why the letter, Mr. Devereux? Why not destroy it?" For the first time, Devereux faltered, his gaze shifting toward the letter in Holmes's hand. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The room was suffocating now, thick with the weight of unspoken truths, as Holmes's eyes locked onto Charles Devereux. For a brief, fleeting moment, Holmes saw something shift in Devereux's face, a flicker of panic, a tightening around his eyes, a stiffening of his posture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough for Holmes to know that he was close, too close. Devereux, struggling to maintain his composure, stepped back slightly, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he clasped them behind his back. "I told you," he said, his voice laced with an uneasy edge. "I don't know why Blackwood wrote that letter. I hadn't seen him for weeks before tonight. If you think—" His voice cracked, and for the briefest moment, Holmes saw him as a man lost in his own tangled web of lies. Holmes stepped forward, his expression calm but piercing. "Mr. Devereux, the letter makes it clear that Lord Blackwood was preparing for a confrontation. You had more than just a casual relationship with him. You were involved in whatever decisions he was about to make. You are more than a mere bystander in this case." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them. "Tell me the truth, Mr. Devereux. What was Blackwood planning? What could have driven you to murder him?" Devereux's eyes darted around the room, his gaze restless, searching for some sort of refuge. But there was nowhere to hide. Not now. The weight of Holmes's words pressed upon him like a vice. For a long moment he remained silent, struggling with himself, as though debating whether to reveal the truth, or to keep playing the role of the innocent, hapless cousin. Finally, he exhaled sharply, as if he had come to a decision. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his gaze met Holmes's with a bitter, resigned expression. "I didn't kill him," Devereux said, his voice now raw with frustration. "But I may as well have. What Blackwood was going to do, it would have destroyed everything I had worked for. He was going to sell the family estate to a rival businessman, a man I had spent years keeping at bay." Holmes stood frozen for a moment, absorbing this revelation. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was still something missing, something deeper. Devereux had been motivated by fear, but fear of what? Fear of losing his inheritance, yes, but was that truly enough to drive him to murder? It didn't add up. "But why the letter?" Holmes asked, his voice laced with quiet insistence. "Why leave a trail so obvious for us to follow? If you were desperate to keep your secrets hidden, this letter would be your undoing. Why not burn it, as you must have burned the rest of your correspondence with Blackwood?" Devereux's face twisted, and for a moment he seemed close to breaking. He ran a hand through his hair, his voice shaky as he spoke. "I didn't want it to come to this. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt. But Blackwood, he had become too stubborn. His mind was set. He was going to sell the land, hand over the estate to that man, and leave us with nothing. My family, my name, it all would have been lost." There it was. The motive, clear and undeniable. Devereux's fear, his desperation, had clouded his judgment. He had feared losing everything he had worked for, and so he had confronted Blackwood. But had that confrontation escalated to murder? Holmes's mind raced, the pieces beginning to align with the clarity of a well-constructed case. Yet even with this confession, something about the situation felt incomplete, as though there was still a hidden layer, another secret lurking just beneath the surface. Devereux seemed to sense this shift in the conversation, and his eyes hardened as he took a step back. "You think I'm lying? That I'm guilty? Maybe I am. I don't know. But I didn't kill him. Not directly. I didn't." Holmes tilted his head, regarding Devereux with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "Then tell me this, Mr. Devereux. If you didn't kill Blackwood, then who did? Who else had a reason to silence him, to stop him from making that decision?" Devereux's face contorted, a momentary flicker of something darker passing over his features. I don't know. But you should be asking about someone else. Someone much closer to Blackwood than I was. Lady Margaret." Holmes's gaze sharpened as Devereux's words hung in the air. "Lady Margaret?" "Yes," Devereux spat, his voice thick with disdain. "She had more to gain than anyone. She stood to inherit everything once Blackwood was gone. The property, the wealth, everything. And when Blackwood started making threats, when he started speaking of selling the estate, she realized her inheritance was slipping away. She couldn't let that happen." The room seemed to close in around them, and Holmes felt the weight of this new revelation settle over him like a shroud. Lady Margaret had been desperate, yes, but had she truly been driven to murder her own brother-in-law? Could she have been the one to deliver the fatal blow? Or was Devereux attempting to deflect suspicion, to shift the blame onto someone else? Holmes took a slow step toward Devereux, his expression unreadable. "And why should I believe you, Mr. Devereux? You've already shown that you are not above deceit. You've hidden things from us, manipulated the truth. Why should this revelation be any different?" Devereux's lips twisted into a bitter smile, but his eyes were filled with a raw honesty. "Because I didn't kill him. I couldn't. But I knew someone who could, and someone who had every reason to." Holmes took a deep breath, his mind racing as the weight of the words sunk in. If Devereux was to be believed, then Lady Margaret had become a new and dangerous suspect. The plot had thickened. What was once a straightforward case of family intrigue had now morphed into a tangled web of deception, greed, and murder. Holmes's thoughts were interrupted by a sound from the door. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone was coming. The footsteps outside the door grew louder, and for a moment, Holmes stood frozen, his mind racing through the recent revelations. Devereux had spoken the truth, or at least a version of it, and yet something still felt amiss. There was a crack in the story, a lingering shadow in the corner of the room that refused to be dismissed. Holmes's fingers tightened imperceptibly at his sides as the door creaked open, revealing the figure of Lady Margaret herself, standing in the threshold. She looked every bit the part of the grieving widow, her delicate frame trembling, her hands clutching her shawl as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her face, pale and drawn, held the trace of sleepless nights, of a woman driven to the brink by her own secrets. She had the look of someone who had already seen too much, and yet had more to give. "I need to speak with you," Lady Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet laced with an intensity that pulled at the air around them. Her eyes, wide with emotion, darted between Holmes and Devereux. "Both of you." Devereux shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor as if he wished he could disappear into the very shadows that filled the room. Holmes regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You've heard, I presume," Holmes began, his voice quiet but edged with a piercing clarity. "The accusations against you, Lady Margaret, the suspicions." Lady Margaret nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She did not speak at first, and the silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then at last, she took a step forward, her gaze fixed solely on Holmes. "It's true," she said softly, her words hanging in the air like fragile glass. "I had everything to gain from Lord Blackwood's death, the estate, the fortune. But I didn't kill him." Holmes's expression did not waver, though inside, his mind was racing. He had suspected as much. The confession seemed too simple, too ready. It had been too easy to point a finger at Lady Margaret, and now, with Devereux's admission, it felt almost as though they were trying to deflect the blame. "I didn't kill him," Lady Margaret repeated, a tremor in her voice. "But I knew it would happen." Her breath hitched in her throat. "I knew someone would do it." "Someone?" Holmes echoed, his voice soft, yet laced with underlying tension. "Who?" The room seemed to grow colder, the fire crackling in the corner as though it too were hesitant to listen. Lady Margaret's hands tightened around the shawl, and for the first time she faltered, as though something deep within her was finally breaking free. Her eyes dropped to the floor, and when she looked up again, there was no more pretense. "It was me," she whispered, the words barely audible. Holmes stood still, processing her confession with remarkable clarity. The sudden admission was not what he had expected, and yet, something in her delivery had the ring of truth. "I had no choice," Lady Margaret continued, her voice quivering with regret and fear. "When Blackwood told me he was going to sell the estate to that businessman, I panicked. I couldn't bear the thought of losing everything I had worked for. The property, the title, it was all slipping away from me. I confronted him." Devereux lifted his head at her words, his face pale as he watched her with growing concern. "You confronted him?" he repeated, as if the very idea unsettled him. Lady Margaret nodded slowly, her lips quivering. "I begged him to change his mind, but he refused. He told me there was nothing I could do to stop him. And when I realized he wouldn't listen, When I saw that he was going to go through with it, She trailed off, her eyes clouded with sorrow. I didn't mean to kill him. But in that moment, I did. Holmes stepped closer, his voice soft yet firm as he spoke. And the dagger? Why use such a weapon? It seems too deliberate, too ceremonial for an act of impulse. Lady Margaret's eyes darkened with grief, and she turned her gaze toward the fireplace. It wasn't the plan. I had no intention of killing him, but when I saw that dagger, it was as though everything I had been feeling, my fear, my desperation, came rushing to the surface. I grabbed it in a moment of weakness. I didn't even think about it. I just stabbed him. The room was silent for a long moment. Devereux stood motionless, unable or unwilling to speak, while Holmes stood before Lady Margaret, his eyes narrowed in contemplation. Her confession had been shocking, but Holmes had expected as much. Her motives were not entirely unexpected. Greed, desperation, fear. These were emotions that could drive even the most composed individuals to do the unthinkable. But even now, Holmes's mind kept returning to one question. Why had Lady Margaret allowed Devereux to take the fall for her crime? Why had she allowed the suspicion to build, to let Devereux walk the dangerous line between suspect and confessor? Lady Margaret, Holmes said quietly, his voice softer now. Why did you not come forward sooner? Why wait until now? Her eyes welled with tears, and she blinked rapidly as if trying to hold back the torrent of emotion threatening to spill over. I was afraid, she whispered. I couldn't bear the thought of losing everything I had left. The title, the wealth. Holmes nodded, as though he had been expecting this answer all along. The fear of losing one's status, of being stripped of everything one had worked for, could be a powerful motivator, even for those who seem beyond reproach. Devereux, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. So you used me. You made it look as if I had a motive. You let me take the fall for your crime. Lady Margaret's eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, she appeared to look genuinely remorseful. I never wanted you to suffer, Charles, she said quietly, her voice breaking. But when I saw how easily the suspicion shifted to you, I didn't know what else to do. You were the one with the most to lose, besides me. Holmes turned toward the window, looking out at the night sky that had deepened to an inky black. It had been a long and tangled night, but it was over now. The truth had been uncovered. The mystery was solved. And yet, as he watched the world outside remain still, he felt no triumph. There was no victory in this. Only the quiet understanding that the human heart, complicated, fragile, and often driven by fear, was a mystery far greater than any murder. Turning back to Lady Margaret and Devereux, Holmes spoke, his voice steady and resolute. The law will take its course. You will both have to answer for your actions. The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke as Holmes made his way toward the door, his steps measured, his mind still swirling with the complexities of the case. He paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. Watson, he said quietly, let us go. There is nothing more we can do here. And as they stepped into the darkened hallway, leaving behind the shattered lives of those they had just uncovered, Holmes couldn't help but wonder just how many more mysteries lay hidden beneath the surface of this world, how many more dark secrets awaited their unraveling.